But when we find the gospel biographies of Jesus being written, it's really at the height of ancient biographical writing as a genre.
No, it's not.
A few hundred years after the first century, we find what we call hagiography. And these are stories that tended to include a great deal of accepted embellishment. It was common practice at this time to exaggerate a little bit more than normal in order to really capitalize on the saint or politician you were trying to make an account of.
If that's how Wes Huff defines hagiography, then the Gospels clearly fit that category. They contain legendary elements and exaggerations. Just look at Matthew's story where the dead rise from their tomb and walk through Jerusalem. That's not sober historical reporting. That's literary embellishment. So if Wes thinks hagiographies are unreliable, he should be consistent and apply the same skepticism to the Gospels. Also, Wes often claims in other videos that we have strong historical reasons to believe most of Jesus' disciples died for preaching the resurrection. But where do those martyrdom stories come from? Actually, they come from the same kind of hagiographies like the Acts of Philip and Acts of Andrew that Wes says are full of embellishment. If those aren't reliable, then the whole argument about the disciples dying for their testimonies collapses.
However, between these 2 points, between proto-biographical material and hagiographical material, we actually find standards being laid down by ancient individuals, historians like this guy named Lucian, who writes a document titled How to Write History.
Of all the ancient writers Wes could have cited to support the Gospels, he picks Lucian, the one who would have been the most skeptical of them. Lucian wasn't even a historian in a formal sense. He was a sharp critic of religious gullibility, so it's bizarre that Wes appeals to him. Even stranger, Wes talks as if the gospel writers were influenced by Lucian's standards, but Lucian wrote in the 2nd century, long after the Gospels were already written. There's no connection between them. If anything, the Gospels reflect the exact kind of uncritical miracle storytelling that Lucian mocked. Hello my friends, this is Shen from Mindful Living. On this channel, I explore topics that help us sharpen our critical thinking, especially when it comes to religion. The goal isn't to trash religion, but to bring our beliefs into better alignment with reason. So, who is Lucian? He was a 2nd century satirist, well known for his sharp critiques of religious gullibility. He wasn't a friend of any religion, not paganism, not Christianity. Since Wes brought him up, I strongly encourage my viewers to read Lucian's works for themselves. He had a keen eye for how easily people distort facts and invent stories to serve their agendas. Truth wasn't valued as it should have been in his time, and Lucian despised that. Honestly, not much has changed. In an age of fake news and viral misinformation, his work still feels surprisingly relevant.
And he stresses things like impartiality, detachment, and rigorous devotion to the truth that characterizes an ideal historian.
That's true. Lucian absolutely emphasized those values. Let me read to you what he actually says. History abhors the intrusion of any least scruple of falsehood. And again, a historian may nurse some private dislikes, but he will attach far more importance to the public good and set the truth high above his hate. He may have his favorites, but he will not spare their errors. For history, I say again, has this and this only for its own. If a man will start upon it, he must sacrifice to no God but truth. He must neglect all else. Were the gospel writers devoted to God? Yes. Did they write to promote their faith and religious messages? Yes. And that alone tells us they fall short of the ideal historian Lucian describes. Wes didn't have to invoke Lucian, but he did. And in doing so, he ends up undermining his own case. The Gospels do not reflect the standards of rigorous, impartial historiography, even by ancient standards.
And Luke, in his gospel account of Jesus Christ, in the preface, exemplifies when we see him saying that he's undertaking the task of writing an account, and to do so, he's interviewing eyewitnesses.
That's not accurate. Luke does not claim to have interviewed eyewitnesses, and he certainly does not reflect the standards laid down by Lucian. Wes is overstating what Luke says in his prologue. Luke mentions that eyewitness accounts were handed down to the community he belongs to. He doesn't say he spoke with any of those eyewitnesses himself. What Luke does say is that he investigated everything from the beginning, but that could simply mean he gathered information from other second-generation Christians or existing written sources, such as the Gospel of Mark. We cannot confidently say that he interviewed primary witnesses because he never tells us who his sources are, and that matters. Anyone can write a prologue that sounds confident and methodical. Without naming sources or showing how the information was verified, those words don't carry much historical weight. This isn't nitpicking. In serious historical work, those details make all the difference. Writers like Plutarch and Suetonius often named their sources and explained how reliable they thought those sources were. None of the Gospel writers does that. Wes claiming that Luke meets Lucian's standards actually shows the opposite. Lucian called for impartiality and detachment, not rhetorical confidence or vague appeals to tradition.
And these are the words of people, while they might not have had firsthand knowledge of, say, the rigorous standards that individuals like Lucian were laying down, they're certainly aware that what you say requires a level of authenticity and truthfulness to it that can be measured and held in terms of historical quality.
They are certainly aware? How does Wes know that? What exactly is he basing that on? If Luke was aiming for historical credibility, why didn't he name any of his sources so we could verify his claims? Take the census story in Luke. He claims there was an empire-wide registration that forced Joseph and Mary to travel to Joseph's ancestral town, not just his parents' hometown, but the place tied to the ancestor who lived 1,000 years earlier. There's no historical record of any Roman census operating in such a bizarre way. Then there's Luke's genealogy, which traces Jesus all the way back to Adam. How could that possibly be verified? How do we know it isn't simply invented? Without any way to check these claims, how can Wes say with a straight face that Luke demonstrates a level of authenticity that can be measured?
Or John, in his letter of 1 John that we find in the Bible, he states in that letter that which from the beginning, which they heard, which they saw, which they touched. These are things that they were there for. Individuals like John are using criteria and historical analysis that are some of the best that we see within the Greco-Roman biographical world.
This is a serious overstatement. First, claiming to be an eyewitness doesn't automatically make someone's writing meet the standards of a historian. That should be obvious. Second, we don't actually know who wrote 1 John. It might have been the Apostle John, or it might not have. Scholars disagree, and Wes doesn't offer any argument here. He just assumes the authorship. Even if we grant that the Apostle John wrote the letter, 1 John is not a historical work. It's a pastoral letter addressed to the early church. It was never intended to be a biography or a history. If Wes wants to take that letter and use it to validate the Gospel of John, he needs to make a case for why those two books are by the same author. He can't just assume his audience agrees, especially when many scholars are cautious or skeptical on that point. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Gospel of John really was written by an eyewitness. That still doesn't mean it reflects the standards of good historiography. The Gospel includes long theological speeches attributed to Jesus, written in a literary style that is noticeably different from the other Gospels. That suggests significant editorial shaping, yet the author never tells us he is paraphrasing. He presents them as direct quotations. That's not how responsible historians are supposed to write.
And the Gospels are being written in this exact time window where the apex of the standards of biographical information intersected with a conscientious notion of history.
Let's set aside the obvious issue here. Most of the Gospels were written before figures like Plutarch, Suetonius, and Lucian, who lived and wrote in the early to mid-2nd century. So it's already a stretch to say that the Gospels fall within that same window. But even if we ignore that, Wes's claim still doesn't hold up. It's simply not true that the 1st and 2nd centuries represent the high point of historical writing in the ancient world, followed by a decline. into a sloppy storytelling. Every era produced both serious historians and embellished accounts. Wes claims later centuries were dominated by hagiography, but that only describes what happened in certain religious circles, especially among Christians. It says nothing about the broader historical landscape, where many works were still being written with a high degree of care and critical method, often more so than the Gospels. Take Cassius Dio, for example. He wrote his Roman history in the 3rd century. His method wasn't perfect, but he names his sources, admits when they are unreliable, and openly discusses conflicting reports. That level of transparency already puts him closer to Lucian's standards than any of the 4 Gospels. The same can be said for Arrian, another historian in the same century. Even Eusebius, the 4th century Christian historian, shows more awareness of historical method than the Gospel writers. Despite his theological agenda, he documents his sources and tells readers where his information comes from. When it comes to biography, the same pattern holds. Eusebius' Lives of the Sophists at the end of the 4th century offers detailed accounts of Neoplatonist philosophers. There are other biography writers such as Procopius, Ammianus, and Priscus. These writers, across several centuries, demonstrate that the tools of good history were still being used long after the Gospels were written. So when Wes calls the 1st and 2nd centuries the epics of biographical writing and tries to position the Gospels at the center of it, he's overselling their historical value. Even if we accepted that time period as the peak, the Gospels show very few traits that would align them with the best historical works of the era. None of the Gospel writers identifies their sources, except when quoting the Old Testament. We know Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, but neither of them mentions it. They never cite other accounts, weigh conflicting traditions, or warn readers when something might be based on rumor. That's a far cry from the standards Lucian described and from what other ancient historians were doing.
You might have heard of Alexander the Great. He died in 323 BC. And the earliest of the comprehensive material we have for Alexander the Great's life comes from a guy named Arrian, who's writing about 450 years after Alexander actually lived. And yet, for the biblical Gospels, they're being written within a few decades after his death.
This is a popular apologetic claim. I've heard it many times, but it's misleading. The fact that Arrian wrote centuries after Alexander while the Gospels were written just a few decades after Jesus might sound like the Gospels should be more reliable, but that's not how historical reliability works. The timing of a written account is only one factor. What matters more is the quality of the sources, how the author uses them, and how transparent they are about the process. Arrian based his biography on the works of Ptolemy and Aristobulus, 2 of Alexander's contemporaries. He explains why he trusted them, notes where they disagree, and evaluates their claims critically. That's what responsible historians do. Now compare that to the Gospels. The writers never identify their sources, never explain how they evaluated different reports, and never acknowledge contradictions. Yet those contradictions are there, especially in the resurrection accounts. And we don't even know who the authors were. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added later. So yes, the Gospels are closer in time to the events they describe, but they are far less transparent and show little evidence of critical method. And here's something else Christian apologists often leave out. Historians are sometimes accused of having a double standard, accepting Arrian while rejecting the Gospels. But that's not true. Historians do treat Arrian's work as valuable, but they also set aside his reports of omens or divine oracles. They apply the same standards to the Gospels. Miracle claims are filtered out, not because they are in the Gospels, but because they fall outside what historians can verify. That's consistency. On the other hand, if Christians want us to accept the miracle stories in the Gospels as historically reliable, are they willing to believe the supernatural claims found in other ancient histories too? Usually they aren't. So who is really applying a double standard? And it gets worse. Wes appeals to Lucian as a model for historical standards, but completely overlooks what Lucian actually warned about. which is how quickly false testimony can spread. In the death of Peregrinus, Lucian recounts how he watched Peregrinus burn himself alive on a pyre, surrounded by grieving followers. To amuse himself, Lucian made up a story. He told latecomers that an eagle had risen from the flames and declared, "I am through with the earth. To Olympus I fare." Within days, someone repeated the tale back to him as if they had witnessed it themselves. That's how fast religious myths can form, and we shouldn't be surprised. Even today, rumors spread rapidly, especially when people want to believe, want attention, or are grieving someone they admire. In emotionally charged settings, people sometimes invent or pass along stories to comfort themselves and others. If a miracle claim can take root within days, as Lucian's satire illustrates, then the fact that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death should not reassure anyone about their historical accuracy. I've said this many times on my channel. I am not against religion or religious belief. My concern is about the mindset people use when practicing or defending their faith. Wes brought up Lucian, and ironically, I agree with Lucian's view on historical integrity. Lucian said that a historian must sacrifice to no God but truth. He must neglect all else. That's academic honesty. Does Wes actually believe in that principle? I'm not saying all Christian scholars fail here. Many liberal Christian academics make a genuine effort to separate their faith commitments from their scholarly work. They care about integrity. But I cannot say the same for Wes. He repeatedly exaggerates and misrepresents historical facts. His claim that the 1st and 2nd centuries were the peak of biographical writing and historiography standards is simply not true, as I've shown. And honestly, I'd like to believe Wes is simply misinformed rather than intentionally misleading. But either way, it's important to hold public voices accountable, especially when they represent a faith to the world. All of this raises a deeper question. Would a real God require someone to abandon intellectual honesty in order to inspire faith? I don't think so. Wes can continue down this path if he wants. He may still be popular in Christian circles, but to many outsiders, especially those trained in history, he's becoming irrelevant. And that's a shame. These are hard words, I know, but I say them for the sake of Christians who genuinely want to reach others. If you care about truth, you should care about the credibility of those who speak for your faith. If you find it difficult to challenge them when they are being dishonest or sloppy, what does that say about your faith? If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to see more of my critique of Wes Huff, check out my video on his interview with Piers Morgan. Just click a link on the screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.